Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Susan Mims, the President and CEO of Dogwood Health Trust, and I am thrilled to welcome you to our Western North Carolina Capital Landscape Assessment webinar. As we strive to create a region where every generation can live, learn, earn, and thrive, no exceptions, we know that one of the most important steps is to gain a deeper knowledge about the gaps and opportunities that exist in our region. And that's why Dogwood has already commissioned extensive studies on the issues of housing, early childhood, and K-12 education, and now an analysis of the growth capital ecosystems in Western North Carolina. We're pleased to share this study with you today and to offer all of these reports for free download from our website. I'd now like to introduce Sarah Thompson, who serves as our Community Investment Vice President for Economic Opportunity. Sarah is going to share a little bit about the study and how it relates to our economic opportunity strategies. So I'll turn it over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Dr. Mims, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Dogwood is investing deeply in economic opportunity as we see it as one of the greatest tools in the fight against poverty and the best way to improve all of the social drivers of health. A key component of our investment portfolio in this area aims to address the economic ecosystem of Western North Carolina and also the small business and entrepreneurial networks that exist here and the organizations that support those entrepreneurs. So over the past several months, we've been working with some folks that I'll introduce here in a minute to conduct an analysis of the capital ecosystems in the region for small business development and growth. Ultimately, our goal is to help create an economic ecosystem that serves as the driving force for creating and sustaining multi-generational wealth and an equitable quality of life for all of the region's residents. And this newest study is going to help us inform our work. So we are a region of predominantly small businesses. And we want to ensure that entrepreneurs have the support and the capital that they need. We observe that there are a lot of resources in the region for small business owners and entrepreneurs, but they're not always finding them or connecting with them. And we hope that all of the organizations in the region that work in this space will be enthusiastic about participating in this ongoing conversation. Identify where you fit in this ecosystem and help us improve the connectivity and strengthen the system for the ultimate clients being the small business owners and entrepreneurs that really make this economy what it is. So I want us to all look at this regionally, help entrepreneurs in the region feel like they are part of a regional ecosystem of business support, training, capital, peer support, etc. So now I'm excited to introduce to you the team that conducted this extensive analysis. And they're going to go over their work and the results of their work with you today. Jesse Fripp is the founding principal and CEO of Shining Rock Ventures, a WNC-based firm that supports the success of enterprises and entrepreneurs in left-behind rural and mountain communities around the world. Jesse is a recognized global expert in enterprise strategy and innovation, with a focus on business transformation, catalytic capital strategy, corporate governance and risk management, fintech and digital disruption, climate enterprise, sustainable economic growth and development, and impact capital ventures. David Lilly, president of Lilly Consulting Group, is a business growth and development advisor with 25 plus years of experience in starting and expanding businesses, new products, and new companies. He has created and grown businesses in diverse industries such as technology, e-commerce, energy, utilities, and clean technology. Both Jesse and David live in Western North Carolina in the Dogwood footprint. It's been a pleasure to work with them on this study, and I'll now turn the program over to Jesse and David. After they're done, we will have some time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please type them into the chat, and we'll do a little moderated Q&A when you're finished with your presentation. So with that, Jesse and David, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mims, and to you, Sarah, for the very kind welcome and introductions. And to all of our regional stakeholders who have taken this time to be with us here today. Of course, as well to the Dogwood Health Trust team that's making this interaction technically possible. And we'll just tee up our study. So it's a real privilege for David and I to be with you and to have the opportunity to share some highlights from the assessment. We hope this initial inquiry will serve as a starting foundation for an ongoing and a deeper conversation and collaboration across the region around the issues of access to growth capital for small businesses. And as Sarah, as you pointed out, we look forward to preserving some time for Q&A at the end. Sarah, you've already kindly introduced us. So jumping right in, as our starting point, it's important to set the tone in terms of the aims of our assessment, building on Sarah's kind introduction. This effort emerged largely from a number of conversations with leaders and institutions from across the region, both those involved in making capital available, as well as those supporting small businesses and non-capital support services. And those interactions led to an emerging realization that there was not a clear and consistent single place where everyone, including most importantly, as Sarah pointed out, those businesses that are seeking capital and support for growth could get an updated understanding of what was available at a regional level in terms of the capital and enterprise ecosystem. So in short, the assessment emerged to begin to define what the regional capital ecosystem is in terms of the who, the what, the when, the where, and the how. Our hope in this was and continues to be to bring clarity, understanding, and greater coordination and collaboration in improving outcomes for small businesses in our region by helping to enable the whole essentially to be greater in effect than the sum of the individual parts. So I should note that we focused on those institutions and organizations either currently active within the core 18 county region of Western North Carolina as defined in the Dogwood Health Trust footprint, or with a clear commitment to focus service delivery in and to this region in the immediate future. So there were some in that category. Again, the primary audience of the assessment is capital providers, in other words, investors, lenders, and their supporting partners. And very importantly, again, capital seekers, in other words, the small businesses in the region. The other note, just contextually, is that this assessment is very much a snapshot in time. There's a lot happening. There's a lot moving at the moment. New resources are coming online, and many of the organizations that are involved in the assessment or were involved in the assessment are actively developing new strategies that could certainly further benefit our region in the near future. So we essentially endeavored to make the perfect the enemy of the good. And what you see here today and what you read in the report when you access it is reflective of what we were told about commitments and focus sort of in this moment. So just a few words before we dive in on the sort of the methodology and approach. Our study was primarily built on sort of old-fashioned direct interview process with those active in capital provision or support services in the region. As you can see from this summary and also the details in the report, we reached out to and spoke in depth with virtually everyone who is currently focusing capital and services in our region today. We also engaged with certain providers who aren't specifically focused on the region, but who are providing resources or making services available to businesses and other partners here. So many of those are noted in the annexes to the public report. And generally, we broke our interviews down with specific focus on sort of three core capital ecosystem actor groups. Those were namely investors, and that spans the full gamut of angel, venture capital, private equity, impact, and the like. We also focus quite a bit on lenders, sort of all forms of debt providers, term debt, guarantee facilities, refinancing facilities, mezzanine finance, and so on. And also, very importantly, we spent time engaging with business support organizations, and that spans the full gamut, again, of foundations, philanthropies, business accelerators and incubators, community college, small business centers, and the like. So in that process, we did conduct a lot of follow-up verification and validation with the interviewees to try to ensure that what is available in the report was as accurate and complete as possible. We also reinforced those interviews with a good bit of public source data analytics on regional demographics, enterprise composition, capital flows, and areas related to that, using such resources as the U.S. Census, the Small Business Administration, Data Axle, the U.S. Venture Capital Association, and other verified data sources, as well, of course, as public information available or made available by the different interviewee organizations and others. So that's just a bit of context setting there really to get us started. And now I will pass the baton on to my esteemed colleague, David, who will dig into the highlights of the actual findings, what we're here for today. So David, over to you.
Great, thanks, Jesse, appreciate it. So the findings were an interesting sort of overview of the region. The first and foremost finding was that we have a robust and very dynamic entrepreneurial environment here in the region. There's plenty of activity going on, both from the demand side, entrepreneurs looking for capital, and from the supply side, the investees and the sources of venture capital and angel investment in the region. And that basically translates to that there are capital of all kinds available out there in the region for investment. And that capital could be early, mid-stage, or late-stage capital. It could be debt, equity, it could be quasi-equity. There's a variety of all forms of capital available in the region for investment. So that's the interesting part, is that it's we've got the ecosystem that we all want to have in the region, except for only 3 to 5% of the entities that are out there are actually gaining access to capital from within this region. That's excluding commercial banks, by the way. We're focused on, kind of earlier than bankable entities. So the challenge is, why are only 3 to 5% of the capital seekers in the region actually finding and gaining access to the capital that they need to expand their businesses? And that is really a result of a few factors. One is it's a pretty fragmented and uncoordinated capital ecosystem out there. The enterprise enabling component of it is a little uncoordinated. So the fragmentation, the lack of organization, some overlapping, and some lumpiness is a term that I'll use in the rest of the presentation, is what causes the difficulty in locating the capital that's stage appropriate for the entrepreneur who's seeking it at the time they're seeking it and at the stage that their business is in. The capital is heavily skewed towards the early stage venture capital. There's a lot of accessible capital out there at $25 or $50 or $100,000, but there's not as much available in later stages, as you'll see through the rest of the presentation. And there's a skew in the region towards all that capital being kind of concentrated in one place. And that's, of course, our MSA, our Asheville-Buncombe County MSA, and a little bit south to Hendersonville. But as you'll see in some maps that we provide here in a little bit, that lumpiness of location is also a challenge, because counties out west, and Macon County, Clay County, Cherokee County, may not have access to immediate capital there in their locale. So they have to reach out to the Asheville MSA region typically, or other sources of capital, to gain access. And then there's the underfunded startup and pre-seed stage segments that are critical to building a long-term healthy pipeline. Those are basically, they're funded, but they're underfunded. If we could get 100% of the companies seeking capital to access capital, then we'd have a greater pipeline of companies succeeding and growing to the bankable, investable status that we all want them to reach. So that's just a very big summary of the key findings of the report. We'll go into some detail here. Go ahead, Jess. So just to give you an idea of how we broke down the study, we started with startup and pre-seed stage ventures, and those are newly established businesses up to about a year and a half in age, not consistently generating revenues typically, but more in product design and development. And the funding needs there are generally pretty small. They're $5,000 to $250,000. A lot of those funding opportunities are funded through grants or occasional debt offerings, usually very patient debt because it's very early stage, and or of course quasi or equity funding through angels investments, friends and family rounds, things like that. The second stage is the seed stage entrepreneur. That's typically, around 6 months to 2 years, maybe 12 months of activity in the marketplace. They're beginning perhaps to generate recurring revenue, and their funding needs are of course going up. $250,000 up to $3 or $4 or $5 million in equity is typically sought at that stage in the organization's life cycle. Starting to look at debt for working capital and other sources of funding that go beyond just the early stage equity. And then finally, what we call early stage entrepreneurs, they're close to achieving break even or profitability. They've got good revenue run rate at or approaching $1 million typically in annual revenue. And then funding resources now tend to be in the millions of dollars, $1 million, $5 million, $10 million range. And a little bit lower for debt offerings typically at that point, but still a pretty good $250,000, $500,000 debt range. So those are the three stages that we kind of looked at: startup, pre-seed, seed stage, and then early stage. And I'll turn it back over to Jesse here.
Thanks, David. It's a great setup for the discussion. So digging a bit further into sort of the nitty-gritty of how these stages sort of align across the region with capital provision. This graphic snapshot is in the report, is really intended to highlight sort of what we observed in that a lot of the capital in the region is focused on the smallest number of companies, sort of on the left-hand side, the pointy end of the pyramid. Likely numbering, in this, the hundreds at best, while less of the capital is focused on that broader base of the pyramid, where you have more companies sort of coming in or emerging, and which really serve as the future pipeline of potential growth businesses and enterprises. And those, we think, potentially number in the thousands in our region, and we'll talk a bit more about that. For context, we know that from our public data source polls and analysis that there are at least 45,000 currently active registered tax-paying small businesses, i.e. those that have less than 49 employees, active in the 18-county region. And we estimate that those businesses employ roughly half of the working regional population, just to kind of give a sense of context. And also, I think important to note that at least 3,000 of those small businesses are owned by people of color, primarily African-American, Hispanic, and Native American entrepreneurs. To kind of counterbalance that and give some further context, there are approximately 450 medium and large businesses. So going up, from 49 employees up to 500 to 1,000, which essentially employ the other half of the regional working population. And we're not focused on that group of 450 medium and large businesses, primarily because they operate in a different kind of capital ecosystem. So if we look at the capital deployed in the tier, and this is sort of on the right-hand side, a snapshot from the interviews, actually tabulating the currently deployed capital that our interviewees updated us on in the process of those conversations. We can see, building on what David outlined, there is good news. I mean, there is capital available in every tier. It's not insignificant, but there are some emerging areas of concern. On the good news, I think starting there, we have an identified active small business portfolio of capital of over $65 million in debt funding. That's primarily, but not exclusively, through community development finance institutions. I think we probably have some of our colleagues on the line today. We have a close or around $300,000 in some of that angel investor kind of friends and family as well, quasi-equity and equity. That might be understated because that kind of capital is a bit hard to track because it tends to kind of happen at an individual level. There is more than 10 million in seed and early stage venture equity, and we think that's actually on a growth trajectory, most likely. And also importantly for the startup ecosystem, there's about $500,000 in available grant funding from various sources. So that all sounds pretty promising. But again, going back to the point of the inverted pyramid, if we look at the base, we look at those businesses that are less than 12 months old, they have access to roughly 14 million in capital, primarily patient debt, if we can call it that, from the CDFIs and community banks. Then the next tier is the businesses, who have survived their first year, or sort of hitting equilibrium. Some of them, if they're on a growth trajectory, might be entering something we call the Valley of Death, and a rather scary sounding name. Halloween is behind us, but David will talk a little bit more about that in a moment. These businesses have access to about 20 million in capital based on the assessment, mostly again patient debt, but we're getting to see some more equity type of investments from angels as well as from some of the VCs at this stage. And then finally, at the peak of the pyramid, again, that the strong they're businesses who are generating profits, recurring revenue, ready to really take off. They have access to roughly 33 million in capital, including both debt and equity. So we, that is kind of the upshot of that reality. And again, as David mentioned, if we look at the context of the total number of small businesses operating in our region, this means that we estimate about 3 to 5% of our regional small businesses are getting access to that formal capital sources that allows them to grow and thrive. And I should mention that, not all businesses are, on fire and moving, consistently up this, pattern of growth stages. Some businesses settle in and just continue to operate year on year, but every business needs capital at some point in their life cycle. So I think just flagging that, it is important. We have a lot of good sources identified, some lumpiness, and some perhaps disequilibrium in the business life cycles. But we probably need some more capital flowing into the region. So this is another way of sort of looking at this, kind of continuing to keep the focus on the good news. This is intended to kind of give a snapshot if you're listening, if you're a small business, you want to see where you sit in that kind of life cycle, and who you might be able to talk to about some of your funding needs today. This is not an exclusive list by any means. The details, a lot of details are in the report. There's a matrix that shows in much greater detail all the organizations and the type of support services and capital they provide. What is important to note is that the different institutional providers seen here in this snapshot often have sort of a more specialized focus at enterprises at different stages or different parts of their trajectory and their journey. So if you're a business owner, it's important to sort of understand where you fit, what kind of focus or support services and capital a particular institution that you might be engaging with offers, and just to be sure that you're aligned there so that you make good use of your time and get a higher opportunity for a positive result from that conversation. I should note there's another category of providers that are not shown here. They're detailed in the report. This includes the essential business support organizations. They cut across, again, this whole range of enterprise stages. Many of the CDFI lenders shown here do provide technical support, including all of those that are noted here. In addition, on the capital front, there are a number of specialist investment vehicles that might prioritize opportunities around things like new market tax credit projects. For example, those focused on downtown redevelopment. Perhaps you're a business owner in an area like that, and that could create some opportunities there for you. There are a number of different types of small business guarantees, including some that are highly localized, some that are regionalized, some that are statewide. And there's also really mission-focused financial service providers. For example, one that we interviewed that focuses on helping small business owners of color to purchase commercial real estate in which they operate to help them, build asset value and bankability. So again, look for those details in the report. Includes a listing of all those providers that we interviewed. The matrix is there. And David, maybe I'll turn it back to you to discuss a bit one of the potential challenges for the growth trajectory question that we identified in the regional ecosystem coming out of the assessment, and that's the so-called valley of death, as well as some of those concerns you mentioned earlier around the geographic lumpiness in terms of physical access to capital and support resources across the region. So David, I'll pass it back over to you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for that. So at the top of this graph is the same three kind of segments that Jesse laid out in the inverted pyramids and pyramids graph that you saw a little bit earlier, or graphic that you saw a little bit earlier. But this is a kind of our version of a problem that we've noted in a lot of other capital stacks in the US and abroad, and that is what's called the Valley of Death. This was a concept that actually very early in Silicon Valley's growth, the University of California identified as a problem, and that is that there's plenty of capital available for the early stage or startup businesses to kind of get up and running and get moving. And that allows a significant number of businesses to get into the starting blocks and get off the off the starting blocks into the race. But then what happens is there's this centerpiece where we refer to it as the Valley of Death, where the capital available dips below the net cash flow needs line. And what happens is the pre-seed and seed stage ventures basically can't access the capital that they need in order to continue to develop and grow. And again, those are those investments at $50,000 to $500,000, typically that allow an organization to get to revenue positive, get a product developed and out the door, or get a service built and deployed. And that is capital that is difficult to come by if you don't know where to look and you don't know what the factors behind the capital selection process are. So again, there's money available there, but it's matching that money with the organization in the right stage, and matching it with the organization's product line or product market, and then also matching it with capital that has the right type of patience for that stage of investment. Patience meaning they're willing to stick with you for a longer term than, say, for perhaps a commercial bank would. But then the good news is in the early stage and growth stages of the business, there's more than enough capital available again. There's about $5 million in early stage equity and about $37 million in early stage debt that's issued right now and deployed in the region. And I did see a question come up in the chat earlier. Are we talking about deployed capital? Yes, it's how much capital has actually been put into the region versus how much is actually available. But there's plenty of that kind of early stage equity and early stage debt available once you get through the Valley of Death. So it's easy to find. It's typically pretty large numbers and coming from pretty established organizations in the region. The net cash flow line is flat and even here just because it's kind of the net cash flow that a firm would need in that stage, not so much net cash flow that they would need throughout their life cycle. So that's a good question. Thanks. So basically, this just highlights again, that there's this center stage where it's very difficult to access capital and very difficult to access the right kind of capital. And that's one of the key aspects of the report's findings that we'll look at is, being able to access capital at that stage is crucial to getting that pipeline of larger companies that can invest and kind of continue to live in the region and then grow and begin to redeploy capital as they grow to a healthy ongoing concern. And I'll give you an idea of one of the other challenges. This is, as I mentioned earlier, a regional location has real impact on your access to funding. So if you're an entrepreneur in Macon County, Clay County, maybe even Jackson County or out in Murphy, the capital that's available to you, the closest capital may be in Jackson County, a couple of counties away, or it may be that you have to go into the Asheville area to find that capital. And then even within Buncombe County, the Asheville MSA, there's a concentration of capital, as you would expect, a little bit in the central business district and following the highways south and west and north out of Asheville. So if you had to drive somewhere to get an investment check, this is where you would have to drive to get it. And then there are a couple of other sources in other counties or completely on the center part of the state in Wake County and others where that investment's being made into the region, but from an office that's farther away. So this location lumpiness is another challenge, and then it just makes it harder for businesses that are out there in the small parts of the region, small counties and other things to find the right kind of capital close by for them. And that's something that a number of investment vehicles in the region have said they want to change and get that capital deployed more distributed in a more distributed fashion across the region. And there may be some efforts underway to do that, which of course we want to support and expand on. Okay. So I'll turn it back over here to Jesse, and he can talk about some of the recommendations that we've made as a result of findings that we've had in the report.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks, David. And we'll conclude on this and then preserve time to dig into the Q&A. So really in that conclusion, this sort of snapshot gives a sense of sort of the general recommendations or proposals that we sort of emerged from this assessment process, wanting to put forward for stakeholders to consider that are outlined here and this sort of framework, the convene, inform, grow framework. Essentially, the primary focus that we wanted to articulate was really the need to really continue to break down silos. I mean, those are geographic, segment, sectoral in nature, to encourage and find ways to actively facilitate collaboration, partnership, building across the region and across the capital and support ecosystem, to really get information out to those who need it. I mean, that's primarily focused on the small businesses themselves, but not only. I mean, I think again, some of that siloing that we've seen. I mean, the resources are here, but often not working as efficiently as they could be to really drive that supporting dynamic of growth capital for the businesses in the region. And perhaps really most importantly, just building on that, is to build upon and grow as well that strong organizational and institutional foundation that does exist in the region. I mean, there is a lot, there are a lot of actors. There's a lot of highly capacitized institutions that are really committed to this mission of supporting small and growing businesses. And we do have an incredibly dynamic region. It's noted in the report that in our region, 1 in 6. There's one small business entrepreneur for every 6 population, which is well in excess of the overall greater Appalachian proportion, which is more like 1 in 11, 1 in 12, which is already one of the highest in the United States in terms of proportional entrepreneurship representation, particularly for a rural area. So that potential is definitely here, and we describe that as the convening, the informing, the growing, that regional enterprise investment and support ecosystem stakeholders, again keeping that focus on the small businesses themselves. Happy to dig in, to any of the details here in the Q&A. But and this is, not an exhaustive list. It's a starting point for what we hope will be broader conversations, spark some new collaborations and new thinking. And we hope that our initial effort in producing this assessment will help drive some of that and inform some of that. And I think we've managed to preserve a few additional moments for questions and comments. So maybe we go to that.
Super, thank you, Jesse and David. That was great presentation. It's just very useful information, certainly for Dogwood. I would imagine it's very useful to the partners joining us today as well. I hope that lots of great conversations and perhaps some initiatives grow out of this. So now, Mariah, could you please let us know what we have in the Q&A?
First and foremost, I encourage the group to include some more questions into the Q&A. I know that along the way we had the chance to dive in a little bit already, but for question's sake, I know one question that we got from Grace Fitzgerald was asking if the dollar amounts included were previously deployed dollars or dollars available. And David, you shared that these were dollars that had been deployed. But do you guys want to dive a little bit more into how those historical dollars deployed play into potential or perceived existing dollars available moving into the future?
Yeah, that's a great point. And we can build on that a bit. Maybe I kick off and David, you can add in. I think because of it is dollars deployed, I think David confirmed that. And I think because of the configuration of, for example, the debt financing tends to roll over. So it gets, it's deployed, it's repaid, it's deployed, it's repaid. So that is kind of a constant value we see, and there's more resource coming available, both, well, through various channels. There are some new entrants coming into the region or expanding their existing footprint in the region. There's new funding being made available, and we're starting to see that being deployed. But that number and the debt side is reflective of that actual deployment. And again, the grants, that is a cyclical number. So those are numbers that we've aggregated from the interviews that providers of those grants have described as sort of representing their annual, what they currently put out into the region. So that's sort of a relative constant. The equity side, obviously, has a slightly different cyclicality to it. So that's deployed, but also based on the interviews, it's representative of committed intention of equity providers. And thanks for taking off the screen share so we can see each other a little bit better. So that I think that kind of hopefully provides some helpful nuance to those numbers.
It does, and you touched earlier on about how some of these capital providers have different kind of sectoral or target population desires, and Lynn, please prior apologies if I get your last name wrong, but Lynn Marilla asked if this information includes specific dollars designated for veteran-owned enterprises.
So I guess, yeah, that's a big question. There's more detail in the report, but I think, yeah, there is a pretty, I think, balanced mix of deep focus as well as broad accessibility or broad deployment or broad aperture deployment, as we would call it. So I think particularly for debt, there are some focused programs available. I mean, Mountain BizWorks, others partner, do have specific sort of sectors that have emerged and they identify as being, high potential or of particular importance to the community. There's a major program that's focused on the outdoor economy that Mountain BizWorks operates. There's a program that partner operates or particular sector around childcare related businesses and enterprises that they support. So there are those specific kind of sectors, and you can dig into that both in the report and also in in the websites and available information of those providers.
We're getting lots of questions coming in now, so I'm gonna encourage us to, I'll keep us moving along. So, one of the key findings that you guys shared in the report was this notion of a small percentage of the entrepreneurs accessing capital. Is that deployment into a small number of businesses? Is that due to entrepreneurs not being ready for capital? Or not being able to find it? I guess, Tom Sweeney's question was specifically, is the key issue that many entrepreneurs are not capital ready?
Yeah, I can
David,
jump in on that one
do
if
you
you
want
like.
to lead off on that one? Sure.
Yeah, sure. That is a component of the challenge here. There's no question about it. A lot of entrepreneurs have a good idea, maybe have even a product that they're developing, but they don't have the kind of forward-thinking projections that they need to be capital access ready. So typically what you need to have in hand is at least a very rough business plan. It doesn't have to be a fully finished, 50-page beautiful document, but at least a rough business plan and a couple of years of financial projections, to just kind of show the trajectory on which you expect the business to grow. And that would include both, a revenue assessment. When are you going to start making revenue? How much revenue are you going to start making? That kind of thing, but also an operational expense assessment and then a capital needs assessment. So it's really kind of a fully fleshed out set of financials. And there are lots of organizations that can help with that as part of this ecosystem. Of course, Mountain BizWorks is one. There are others that can help you with getting that information together and being capital ready when you do approach those sources of capital. But it certainly is the case, and I've seen it many times. People out seeking capital with basically a good idea on the back of a napkin, which is a little too early to get out there and ask. Again, avail yourself of the programs that are out there to help with those early stage development.
Absolutely. So we did get one question from Patrick Bowler, specifically around capital providers for those who are interested in addressing the critical housing shortage in the region. So there's lots of different types of entrepreneurs, but we recognize that entrepreneurs who are building housing are a specific slice. So if you could share either if those types of institutions are covered in the study, or maybe other potential resources for Western North Carolina home builders in the housing space where they can find capital.
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe just to touch on that, and perhaps David and even Sarah, you might have some perspectives on that. But we didn't explicitly focus on the developer sector. They're included there. I mean, certainly they could access a number of the resources there. Probably, I would expect. I mean, depending on where they are, if they're a general contractor or subcontractor, maybe the smaller loan sizes for equipment and working capital, things of that nature. Real development finance is a bigger and kind of distinct capital animal. There are providers like if you look at Invest Appalachia, which is emerging in our region more broadly, but very present here in Western North Carolina, does touch on that more specifically. There are a few others that do as well in different ways, often through the new markets tax credit. So really focusing through the enterprise in many cases, or in partnership with sort of local government or other authorities doing, for example, downtown redevelopment or housing starts, things of that nature. It might merit, because it is such a critical issue for for our region. One of, part of the convene, inform, grow recommendations we make is, some deeper dives, maybe more specifically into areas like affordable housing, finance on both sides, the public and the private side of that equation, because there are a number of different elements there that could be leveraged to help to support more momentum in that area. So hope that's maybe
Jesse's kind
David
way of saying it could be a whole webinar itself.
Stay tuned for more. That's it.
Yeah, stay tuned for more. So one question from Tara Schultz was if there are any additional or particular recommendations on how to increase the coordination of these resources within our footprint. How do we make these entrepreneurial and small business resources easier to navigate?
No, it's a fantastic question. And, we do dive into that a little bit in the GROW package of recommendations. And David, I saw you came off mute, so I'll let you lead the swing at that.
Oh, no, don't let me interrupt. Basically the recommendations are to convene, all the players and to really look for opportunities to make it very simple for investor or entrepreneurs to find investment. The metaphor I like to use is aviation metaphor is landing lights. We need a really clear set of landing lights for an entrepreneur who's got a good idea to say, where do I go first? And once they get there, to have an open door that basically says, hey, you got access to capital in a couple of different ways because you're a particular, sector, or because you're a particular kind of entrepreneur. You might have access to unique versions of capital that other people couldn't access. And, convening and making sure that kind of set of landing lights is in place for the region is one of the really crucial things that I think we have to do. I've seen it in other regions where it's, a single office. It's basically the Office of Entrepreneurship is one solution. And that's where, everybody who needs something goes first. And then they get referred out to other resources in the region like SCORE or like, Mountain BizWorks would be in our region, so that they're being referred to the partner who can help them the most at the stage that they're in.
Yeah, and just to build on that as well, I think there are also, resources deployed that are really buildable. And I think, in two areas I would mention specifically, the online and virtual platforms that are available. Supportedly, I would just mention is one of the more developed and deployed ones currently out there. And then the other piece of it, and it goes back to the slumpiness question that David mentioned. We have a really magnificent community college network, and the small business centers, there are terrific. Just using that landing lights, they're terrific, sort of landing places for those entrepreneurs, particularly, more far flung and who might have farther to go to get to resources. And I think, there are real opportunities to sort of intentionalize the coordination and resource sharing and information accessibility, between and among those, perhaps in conjunction in different ways. Just thinking about that.
That's great. So Heather Bauer was curious if there are methods for small businesses to specifically stay apprised of new funding opportunities and funding opportunities, as well as the focus areas or the kind of methodologies of funding of different funding partners in the region. So that's one question. And then along with that as well, and David, you already started diving into this, but what are some of the recommendations of things that early stage businesses should have in hand as they're coming to funders? So I'll let you guys take it away there. So how do you stay aware of what's available, and what should you have when you go there?
Great, two great questions. I think I'll just kick off, and David, we can tag team a little bit. I think in terms of the information availability, the information's out there. It can be a little difficult to get to sometimes if you're just starting out. But the networks are there, both virtually, as we mentioned in the report. You'll see the websites of every one of the institutions that's mentioned there. All of them are highly informational. They describe the programs, they describe the type of products that they have available. Often they'll talk about the second part of the question, what what entrepreneurs should be prepared to bring to a conversation, or even provide some links to resources to help entrepreneurs prepare themselves for those conversations. So that's out there. Sometimes it does take a bit of research time, but I think it's well worth it. And the other piece, of course, is in your community, wherever you might be located, the community colleges, there are different sort of enterprise support organizations, accelerators. Many of the CDFIs also do have those resources available. I know, Sequoia Capital, which serves small businesses in and around the Kuala Boundary, does quite a lot of that as well, and also deploys capital. So I think, a lot of it depends on kind of where you are within the region. But I think those are the on-ramps that are currently available. I don't know, David, if you wanted to add anything.
Just that is really good, a really nice segue, almost as if you knew what the next question was going to ask. So I might encourage us to keep moving along. So we've talked about the lumpiness, we've talked about the regionality to this. Can we dive a little bit more specifically into the high country or the northwestern part of Dogwood's footprint? Can you share more about what the conditions, or dive a little bit deeper into what the conditions are looking like in Yancey, Mitchell, and Avery? I know it's in the study, but maybe to share a little bit more about what the conditions are looking like in the high country.
Yeah, I can comment a little bit on that. I mean, a number of the CDFIs are active there. I mean, Mountain BizWorks, of course, I think has a pretty broad regional footprint. Again, though, in Boone, which I guess is a step outside of the regional area, but they do cover that. Boone does also have a pretty effective angel investment fund, the High Country Impact Fund, which is just launching their second fund, and they are active in their footprint is Boone, but they're active in Asheville and Buncombe and surrounding areas, particularly focusing on, again, that sort of pre-seed seed stage entrepreneur that needs some quasi equity. And they do have again Institute Capital, Carolina Small Business Development Fund are coming, expanding footprint in the region. A partner I mentioned, opened an expanded physical footprint in Asheville, but again, serving the region. So I think that area is covered ostensibly, though perhaps with less, going back to David's lumpiness map, with less physical infrastructure. And again, that is a place where maybe creative partnerships can be developed and built.
I do want to make sure that we give a shout out to May Coalition as well, which is located in Yancey County and is a phenomenal resource in that footprint.
Yeah, thanks for the reminder. And they're noted in the report as well as a resource.
Yes. So we've talked about the regions, we've talked a little bit, but I'd love to dive now more into target populations. Safi Martin asked a couple of questions, really diving into entrepreneurs of color and both, so one question is, are there statistics, data, percentages, like what was shared earlier around what small businesses owned by people of color are accessing and funding? And then if there are any efforts that we're aware of in the region to date that are streamlining access to capital for entrepreneurs of color, recognizing, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Safi, so from my own knowledge and perspective, recognizing the historical and systemic barriers that this population has had in regards to accessing capital. Are we aware of other efforts to make it systematically easier for these entrepreneurs to know where to access capital?
Yeah, no, terrific questions, and really critically important. There are two pieces of that I would respond initially, and again, David, if you have thoughts. But one area, this assessment focused more on the supply side, if you will, so the capital provision. We did touch on some analytics around what the enterprise side looked like, but that was a bit out of scope for this particular assessment. But we do see that there could be a real benefit to doing, and that's mentioned in the sort of the inform part of the recommendations, that a deeper dive on that to really understand exactly that question. What is the actual current access? What are the realities for particularly entrepreneurs of color getting access to financial services, getting access to support services? I mean, there are some really important efforts and initiatives underway. Mountain BizWorks has the Catalyst Fund, which is in its second cohort. Eagle Market Streets Development Corporation obviously has been focused on supporting entrepreneurs of color for a long time. Black Wall Street, Asheville, many of the business support organizations are also making concerted efforts to reach out. And even at the regional level, beyond Western North Carolina, Appalachian Community Capital does have a specific work stream focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, coordination, and broadening and deepening with data analytics and blended finance in partnership with their member CDFIs, which include a number of the member CDFIs in our region. I know as well that Carolina Small Business Development Fund has a pretty strong focus on analytics. So again, those resources are available, though perhaps not yet disaggregated to our region. But again, I suspect, if I had to make a guess based on what I've seen more broadly in some of the data analytics I've been involved with across the greater Southern Appalachian region, the access rates are lower for all the reasons that you mentioned. And there's also a disproportionality of entrepreneurs of color actively running businesses relative to the proportion of the population, which shows that it's not just the challenge to the existing entrepreneurs, it's a challenge to entrepreneurs. What I've heard somebody describe once as wantrepreneurs, people who might be well positioned to launch a business, but are facing obstacles, support obstacles, asset obstacles, credit bankability obstacles, and things of that nature. So I think that is an important area of specific focus. But the good news is things are happening. We just need to find ways to accelerate them and build on them.
Well, thank you so much for that, Jesse. I'm recognizing where we are in the chat and where we are in time. That's going to be our last question for today. It's weird to do a round of applause for Zoom, so I will not do that, but it was so wonderful. And I'm going to pass it off to Sarah to close us out.
Sure. Thank you again, Jesse and David, for this work. It's been a pleasure working with you, and the presentation today was wonderful. And thank you all for joining us to hear about it and to have a bit of a dialogue. You know where to find us at Dogwood, and if you look at the report, which is under community investments on our webpage, you'll find EARN, which is the economic opportunities area, and that's where you'll be able to find copies of the report, where you can track down Jesse and David if you have additional questions for them from their contact information there, and really take some time to digest it and consider the recommendations that came out of it and what we as a region can do to address the gaps in the network and the ecosystem, and really strengthen that connective tissue so that Western North Carolina really can live into its reputation for being an amazing place to be an entrepreneur. We have a lot of resources, and we've only just begun. So let's take this report and run with it and see what great things we can do next. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day, and more to come.